years ago. Great. Okay, thanks very much for coming, everyone, to this afternoon's penultimate Higher Studies seminar for this academic year. It's a great pleasure to have back here at Queen's someone who knows Higher Studies here at Queen's very well, Rachael Young. So Rachael is currently a postdoctoral fellow and program coordinator for Irish Studies at Boston College. She completed her PhD last year at Boston College on the topic of art and argument go hand in hand, community murals as activism in England and Northern Ireland, 1980 to 89. And Rachel's here with us this week, not just as a visiting speaker, but as our Boston College Queen's visiting fellow in Higher Studies. We have an annual exchange, which brings someone from Boston College over here, and we send someone from Queen's over to BC every year. So we'll be advertising that for next academic year. Will be in June, and we'll be able to have a postgraduate one as well as a staff one this year as well. So look out for information about that. So Rachel's going to speak to us today about a topic drawn from her PhD, less violent but no less visible, criminalization and community murals in Brixton and Belfast, 1980 to 89. So, Rachel.
Thank you so much. I am going to stand because I fidget too much when I sit. So I would first like to say thank you, everybody, for coming. I know it is the end of term and we're getting close to that crazy period, and it was also just a bank holiday, so nobody wants to do anything this week anyway. So I do appreciate you all coming. I'd also like to thank Professor Gray for having me here, and also for Kathy Devlin for having the tremendously difficult task of trying to book me a hotel room when Bruce Springsteen is in town. So I don't envy that task, and I know that I can't compete with the boss, so I thank her for kind of taking on that responsibility. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'd really, as Peter said, I would really appreciate any feedback. This does come from our dissertation. I am looking for kind of feedback and advice because I'd like to go kind of further with proposing the book as a monograph. So that giant step forward is the next one. So any kind of feedback or comments you have would be much appreciated. So the scenes of police protests in Brixton and Belfast during 1981 looked remarkably similar. In London, after years of anti-immigrant rhetoric and growing racial tensions, a highly controversial stop and search raid ignited violent clashes between the predominantly white Metropolitan Police and Black Brixton residents. This stop and search policy was one of the many aggressive policing tactics used by Thatcher's law and order government to criminalize the Black community. The Black youths who took to the streets of Brixton in April 1981 publicly displayed their opposition to this criminal label, instead asserting that their community suffered under the discriminatory policies of criminalization. Across the Irish Sea, the minority community in Northern Ireland challenged the Thatcherite policies which dictated the 1981 Republican hunger strike taking place inside Long Kesh. The hunger strike was a culmination of a multi-year Republican attempt to combat the government policy of criminalization, which implemented also aggressive policing tactics and refused to acknowledge the political nature of the continued conflict regarding Britain's role in Northern Ireland. In an attempt to discard this criminal label and regain their special category designation, 10 Republican prisoners refused food, and the first hunger striker, Bobby Sands, died in May of 1981. Images of protest and the protesting public clashing with government forces flooded domestic and international news, often continuing the narrative of these ungovernable and problematic criminal communities. But another type of image would soon populate Brixton and Belfast, providing pictorial proof of a counter-narrative to criminalization, the community mural. While the Black and Republican communities used various methods to achieve their different relationship with the British government, both the Brixton Uprising and the Belfast hunger strike were methods of protesting the same process of criminalization. And this shared fight against criminalization fostered solidarity between the minority communities of these locations, a solidarity that is often overlooked in the historiographies of both Black and Republican activism. My work compares the state-sponsored tactics of criminalization used against the Black community of Brixton and the Republican community of Belfast throughout the 1970s, arguing that both minority groups were criminalized in an attempt to end the crisis of hegemony faced by the post-war British government. Both Black and Republican communities fought against criminalization by highlighting parallel counter-narratives that contended that discriminatory governing and over-policing policies were a negative symptom of Britain's enduring colonial legacy and a detriment to the minority populations of the nation. And one of the most visible ways which these groups displayed these counter-narratives was through painted walls. Examining the creation and use of community murals in Brixton and Belfast after 1981, I argue that murals became a less violent, but no less visible, work the title in, tool to combat the criminalization narrative. As a type of artwork specifically designed for marginalized communities to challenge spatial and visual hegemony, community murals created large public canvases with which disenfranchised citizens could display their own visual representation, a representation to offset the negative imagery portrayed by the British government and the mainstream media. Community murals in Brixton and Belfast became subversive tools used by both minority groups to display their marginalized cultures positively and to combat the negative impacts of the shared criminalization that stemmed from this mutual colonial history. So this presentation is roughly broken into two parts that are not equal. The first one will be exploring the commonalities of cultural hegemony and criminalization in Brixton and Belfast. And the second part will be exploring murals. So I will be sprinting through the majority of my research on criminalization, solidarity between these two communities in order to get to the murals, but I am happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if anyone is interested. So my comparison of criminalized solidarity is built upon Anthony Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony. The Italian philosopher argued that the political and economic control needed to be accompanied by a more influential cultural domination that created a system of consensus, and this system of consensus reproduced the culture of a ruling group as the only acceptable worldview. Any breakage of this reproduction of cultural dominance equated to a rupture of ruling by consensus, leaving a crisis of authority in which the dominant power structure had no choice but to rely on force to retain control. In the famous 1978 work, Policing the Crisis, sociologist and cultural theorist Stuart Hall uses a Gramscian analysis to examine the political and the politics and culture of post-colonial Britain. He argues that, quote, a crisis of hegemony or general crisis of the state, precisely as Gramsci defined it, had indeed been developing in Britain since the spontaneous and successful hegemony of the immediate post-war period. According to Hall, the construction of post-war consensus, rooted in this concept of dominant whiteness and the memory of Britain as a global power, was challenged by the radical ideologies of the 1960s and the continuing decline of the British Empire. The post-war influx of Black and Asian citizens into the metropole meant that the heroic and masculine imperial version of white Britishness could no longer be maintained. This challenge to the traditional hegemony meant that by the 1970s, governing via consent was no longer feasible, causing the state to adopt methods of coercion to create a law and order government. According to sociologist Paul Gilroy, who is a student under Hall, this process of criminalization, or the narrative and legal practice of making the behavior or actions of a specific group criminal, created a more palatable justification for the increase in hard policing as it, quote, provides the popular underpinning for an otherwise unattractive authoritarianism. The criminalization of the Black citizens of Britain began in the 1950s with various government policies and public discussions surrounding the law and order panic and how these morphed into an adoption of legalized discriminatory policing policies. The growing belief that Black people were innately criminal created new types of racial language and stereotypes. And by the late 1960s, crime became the thing that white citizens most identified with and most feared from Black Britons. This fear of criminality and the rise of the law and order government led to increased interactions between the Black community and the police, a force that was over 99% white in Britain and which employed openly hostile and racist policies in their effort to police minority communities. The most infamous discriminatory policy was that of sus. Originating from a section of the 1824 Vagrancy Act, sus laws allowed police to stop, search, and arrest any person suspected of loitering with intent to commit a criminal offense. So no crime actually need occur, no victim was necessary, no witness except for that of 2 police officers was needed to stop and search a suspected person. Sus crimes were also tried in a magistrate court, meaning the accused had no right to trial by jury, and judges would often farther outweigh the testimony of law enforcement than those of persons who were accused. During the 1970s, disproportionate number of Black people were stopped, searched, and arrested to the point where one Home Office document recorded that in 1975, 12% of total arrests involved Black residents, even though Black people only accounted for 4% of the population. The Brixton Uprising brought visibility to the struggles of Black Britons and the counter-narrative of over-policing. following a controversial stop and search campaign, which the community argued was not an attempt to stop crime, but rather punishment for their activist organizing, where police were, quote, let loose onto the streets of Lambeth to harass and oppose Black people by stopping and searching them randomly. A misunderstanding between police and an injured Black youth led to the eruption of violence in Brixton. Police accounts and residents' accounts vary very differently, obviously, but many Black residents saw the uprising as an appropriate response to the police violence used against them and viewed the event as a reclaiming of space, a space invaded, they thought, by an oppressive colonial legacy of the British Empire. Despite the numerous eyewitness accounts of excessive police violence, mainstream British media was quick to refute the counter-narrative of Black residents and instead focused on the narrative of criminalization, running stories like the News of the World headline titled The Bloody Face of Brixton, which you can see in the racist policing box, right? So this face of this bloody Bobby kind of became the face of the criminalized narrative of the Brixton uprising. And while many Black residents of Brixton viewed the uprising as a powerful tool for their continued campaign in racial equality, the violent nature of this form of protest overshadowed discussions of the over-policing narrative behind the event, and the critique of violence led Black communities to turn to other activist tactics to push their counter-narrative further into British consciousness. Britain's colonial legacy also impacted the rise of law and order in Northern Ireland during the 1970s, but the historiographical discussion of the imperial legacy is much sparser, stemming from a larger decades-long debate between nationalists and revisionalists, as many of us are familiar with in this room. Many previous Troubles historians skirt around the assertion that an analysis of Northern Ireland has to discuss Britain's colonial legacy, many fearing that this is a claim only Republicans would make in an attempt to justify military action. This implied connection has lingered until very recently. I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Hugh Bennett, as he'll be here next week. But the type of colonial ties that Bennett beautifully and directly spells out are still relatively few and far between in the field of Troubles history. Yet, if one were to follow the work of political scientist Brendan O'Leary, you would find an almost mirrored argument to that of Stuart Hall. In his 1993 work with John McGarry, O'Leary argued that, quote, there is one indisputable historic cause of the current conflict. Without the colonial plantation of Ulster in the 17th century and its legacy, Northern Ireland would not exist. The book argues that following the creation of Northern Ireland, the Protestant Unionist majority was maintained via hegemonic control. And in O'Leary's 2019 three-volume treatise on Northern Ireland, he argues that, quote, hegemonic control was established between 1920 and 25 by the UUP, and aside from a few exceptional moments, was exercised until 1966. It was during the 60s that the rise of civil rights, as well as modernization attempts from Terence O'Neill, challenged the traditional hegemonic control of the majority community. This process of criminalization of the minority community in Belfast began earlier in the 20th century, but looks very similar. It starts with ongoing fears of disloyal Catholics, leading to the adoption of specifically targeted policies under the Special Powers Act. The Unionist state-sponsor narrative of criminalization argued that special policing tactics were required to reestablish order in Northern Ireland, and this idea continued throughout the 1972 adoption of direct rule by the British government. And then a shift away from the highly political colonial policing model, an official policy of criminalization was introduced in 1976 to police Northern Ireland without regard to political motives, with paramilitary prisoners being treated as ordinary criminals. Under this new policy, the British government allowed for increased home searches, increased stop and search powers that did not require the pretense of suspicion and could be used indiscriminately by police, the arrest, detention, and interrogation of a person for up to 7 days, the introduction of non-jury diplock courts, which had more flexible standards of admissible evidence, and an introduction of scheduled offenses, which carried mandatory prison sentences. Yet, despite these claims of ordinary criminality, the process of criminalization implemented many special tactics to stop criminals, including the use of sus laws, similar to those used against the Black minority in Brixton. Stop and search no longer required allegations of suspicion. Security forces were permitted to stop and detain a person without cause, record personal information, question them, and decide if further detention was needed. And just as the legal implementations of sus in Northern Ireland mirrored that in Britain, the physical implementation of stopping and searching suspicious members of the minority community increased the harassment and detention of innocent civilians, as well as hostility towards the almost exclusively unionist police force. And in a bid to challenge this narrative of criminalization, prisoners inside Long Kesh began blanket protests, dirty protests, and hunger strikes. And in March of 1981, Bobby Sands began the second Republican prisoner hunger strike, an event which was fated to draw global attention owing to Sands' behind bars election to Westminster. Sands's electoral victory, his persuasive prose, and his smiling face drew national and international media to the Republican counter-narrative, which asserted that discriminatory policies of the unlawful occupying British government negatively impacted the minority community and were the real cause of continuing issues in Northern Ireland. And while the strike proved a powerful activist tool for the Republican community, it eventually ended and the Republican community turned to other methods to display their counter-narrative, including the use of community art. So while the Black and Republican communities had different historical and contemporary relationships with the British government, they both became victims of discriminatory policing as the British government attempted to maintain its position as a global power while simultaneously navigating internal challenges and a declining empire. This comparison is often glazed over in works focusing on either race relations in Britain or the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I could actually only find one direct comparison, and that was by Stuart Hall in Policing the Crisis. Hall highlights two 1971 events as what he calls the marking of the arrival of the law and order state. And that's the implementation of Operation Demetrius and the introduction of internment aimed at the minority community in Northern Ireland, and the Immigration Act of 1971, which restricted the migration of Commonwealth citizens without a parent born in the UK, specifically targeting non-white citizens. So my research strives to challenge this historiographical division by highlighting similar legislation, political figures, and policing tactics used to discuss and implement policies of criminalization against both these minority communities. This shared criminalization created solidarity between the residents of Brixton and Belfast, and activists in each location viewed their movements as parallel ones rooted in the same colonial legacy of the British Empire. So I've just kind of put a couple of things on the slide. First, I run through a couple of very familiar names that are in both Belfast and Brixton, including Margaret Thatcher, William Whitelaw, Kenneth Newman, and Leslie Scarman. Both communities have very strong opinions on those figures, which I'm happy to provide juicy quotes on later. And I've also included some instances of solidarity described by these communities, right? So I have a couple of examples of Republican publications in the 1970s, often comparing the rise of policing tactics in London to that of the RUC. And then a couple of Black publications, which are mainly focused in the 1980s, which is really Black activists making the argument that the Irish independent movement should be lumped in with the larger anti-colonial movements that they are kind of seeking solidarity with. So again, sprint, and I apologize for that actual run through criminalization. But with the rest of the time I have today, I want to focus on the specific use of community murals in displaying the anti-colonial and anti-criminalized counter-narrative of both of these minority groups. And while murals in both Brixton and Belfast were created via different processes, the community artworks of both of these places were public canvases with which these minority groups claimed ownership of the physical space of their neighborhood and displayed their counter-narrative against criminalization. So these artworks emerged from a larger global community mural movement rooted in the ideas of bringing visibility to overlooked and under-resourced peoples. This movement began in 1967 with the first official community mural titled Wall of Respect, painted by the Visual Arts Workshop of the Organization of Black American Culture in Chicago. Depicting portraits of influential African-American figures, the artwork brought several new features to painted walls, including features that would come to define community murals, including the painting of a mural outdoors in a neglected working class or minority area, and the choice to consult the community in the aspects of the creation of the mural. This artwork proved a publicly accessible form of expression to people overlooked or ignored by the dominant visual imagery in the public sphere. And this artwork was meant to reflect, engage, and belong to the community in which it was painted. And while the mural historiographies of England and Northern Ireland are also siloed by national borders, murals in both Brixton and Belfast arose from the shared community mural movement. And while community muralists didn't necessarily focus on theory, right? So through the 60s and the 80s, I don't have really any records of muralists talking about their theory of why they chose murals or why murals work. But I do argue that there is a logical explanation for why community murals became effective implements of activism. Essentially owing to both their visual and physical composition, murals can challenge the cultural hegemony of ruling powers. Murals allow minority groups or those not part of the dominant political structure to vibrantly and publicly display their own visual culture, challenging the idea that the cultural hegemony of the dominant power is natural or even valid. And theorists like Jean-Louis Rancière and Henri Lefebvre argue that challenges to institutionalized power structures occur in the realm of both image and public space, and murals combine both. So we're going to start with Brixton. Activist artist and art historian Eddie Chambers argues that the 1980s were, quote, an unprecedented period of Black British creativity, and that the rise of Black consciousness, which manifested in multiple artistic mediums throughout the decade, was specifically linked to the rise of the law and order state and the implementation of criminalization during the 1970s. Intertwined with the larger global Black and post-colonial arts movements, Black art in Britain played a large role in countering the negative narrative of Black citizens. And I don't wish to take away from the fantastic work done on the Black arts movement in Britain. I rather wish to highlight how community art strove to accomplish a similar goal of displaying alternatives to the state-sponsored narrative of inherent criminality via murals. So there is overlap here between the Black arts movement and the community arts movement, but they're not necessarily the same. So I'm going to focus on community art. Community muralists organized in Britain in the late 1970s. These predominantly white artists were educated in traditional fine arts training, but owing to their involvement in quote unquote radical politics of the time, these artists chose to make careers within local communities rather than galleries. Leading figures in the movement like Carol Kenna and Stephen Lobb transferred skills they learned from minority artists in the United States to Britain, creating a guide to achieve the most crucial goal for these artists, community involvement. The pair published a mural manual, which is both a history of and a how-to guide for creating community murals. The booklet argued that, quote, the vital requirements for any mural is that it has a positive relationship with its surroundings and that it responds to the needs and wishes of those who commission it. This puts the responsibility on the muralist to get to know their location and locality and recognize the value of consultation. If you do not consult the people of the locality or community about a mural project, you can expect a justifiable action from them to prevent the project from going ahead. The greatest insult for these artists was to be accused of parachuting into a community, creating unwanted artwork. So based on these reasoning, the muralists of 1980s London crafted various consultation processes that involved communities in the production of art, engaging in a lengthy process of ensuring that the art belonged to those who lived there. And the fact that artists had to bend their artistic whims to the residents of these communities, I think explains why the majority of community muralists in and around London were white. According to Sonia Boyce, who is a very prominent artist in the Black arts movement, quote, many ethnic minority artists were asked to produce murals rather than continue what they are already doing, which meant they were obliged to fit into the role of accessible, public, and popular artists. So for Boyce and many, she argues that many Black artists would rather focus on their own artistic practice than endure the time-consuming and creatively stifling process of community engagement, because even murals created by Black artists in a Black neighborhood like Brixton required extensive community involvement. And there were murals painted in Brixton before the anti-policing uprising, but the type of artwork created in the area after the uprising was very different, and there was a far higher number. So before 1981, there were 4 murals that I can find painted in Brixton, the majority of which were designed for children's play places. But between 1981 and 1988, there were 23 murals painted in Brixton, making it one of the areas that's the most well painted in London. These murals were created by professionally trained artists, often funded by government grants. They took weeks or sometimes months to be painted and were completed via this intricate community consultation procedure to ensure this kind of co-creative design between the artist and the community. And upon the completion of these artworks, it was often marked with a celebratory street party. And this party officially marked the transition from the muralist artwork to the community's artwork. And I do have a couple photos of that. These parties look raging. Like these are huge street parties that they had often on the government's dime to celebrate an artwork. But these murals painted in Brixton during the 1980s fell into 2 categories. So I've categorized them into images of community celebration and anti-conservative political images. But both types of murals provided kind of a pictorial display for the Black community's counter-narrative of discrimination and over-policing. So 11 murals depicting community celebration were painted in Brixton during the 1980s, and each of these murals commemorated or acclaimed the community of which they were a part. So from depicting the long and interesting history of Brixton to exhibiting imagery that displayed the different ethnic groups that comprised the contemporary neighborhood, these murals created a very different visual narrative than the racialized concepts of criminality or un-Britishness promoted by the law and order government. These artworks displayed a sense of community pride and happiness, depicting positivity instead of the negative connotations being made often by the British government and mainstream British media throughout the 70s and 80s. And this theme of community celebration may seem unimportant or non-political, but in a marginalized area attempting to combat the misrepresentations of criminalization, these murals were crucial to breaking the state-sponsored idea that crime was synonymous with the expression of Black culture. Now, these images are also part of a larger debate within Black art regarding accusations of municipal multiculturalism, or essentially the accusation that local governments would often or sometimes fund Black art at the expense of flattening or de-radicalizing the racial issues of the artistic movement. And this is a hugely complicated and internal debate within the Black arts movement, which I could spend the entire 40 minutes talking about. So for now, I will just highlight the fact that after 1981, many Black activists, artists, and academics argued that it was crucial to create representation of Black citizens that fell, quote, outside the categories of problem and victim. And these murals did just that by providing depictions of Black citizens as integral and celebrated parts of the South London neighborhood. I'm going to show you the first mural in Brixton. I apologize. It's really creepy, but if I have to see it, so do you. These are the creepy children of my favorite Brixton mural. They will haunt your dreams. And it's my goal to show them to as many people as possible, because if they haunt mine, they have to haunt yours too. So this is the first post-uprising mural painted in Brixton. It was commissioned by the Lambeth Council and was created by Stephen Pusey in 1981. A child of Irish and Indian immigrant parents who spent his childhood in Brixton, Pusey knew that for any artwork to thrive in that area, it had to engage with and respect the locality's history and its residents. So after securing a location above the Brixton Astoria Theatre, he began, quote, presenting the idea of the mural to the local community. The artist's previous mural in Covent Garden had depicted community activism and political issues, and Pusey wanted the same for this Brixton artwork, saying, quote, my initial idea for the Stockwell Park Road mural was to paint something that would depict the struggle of the local community and the recent tensions that had violently erupted in April 1981. But Pusey found that after endless meetings and presentations with residents, that, quote, residents rejected this idea and proposed a more celebratory design. The celebratory design they chose was Children at Play. It is a 30-foot by 100-foot mural depicting 18 smiling children, all in neon day glow of the 1980s. Yeah. They're all playing together, implying that the natural condition of children uncorrupted by racism is this peaceful coexistence. So photographs of local children were used as reference to create a vision of Brixton not riddled with crime, but an inherently peaceful location struggling to thrive with limited resources, which only erupted into violence because of discrimination. By placing this mural in the social and political context of a community which had just witnessed a race-related anti-policing uprising, the mural makes a political statement in opposition to criminalization. And I will say that Pusey, so the quote in the middle, so he's one of these artists. He actually found this process. He so greatly did not want to paint this mural theme. He very much wanted to paint something else. And he was so upset that the community wanted something different that he stopped painting community murals. He basically decided that the process was too stifling for his creativity because he couldn't do what he wanted. And so he never painted another community mural. This still stands in Brixton to this day. And if you ask Stephen Pusey, he's not happy about that at all. I love it. I think it's great. So moving on, kind of the second theme that painted in Brixton during the 1980s was these overtly left-leaning political ideologies, right? So 5 such murals were painted in Brixton between 1981 and 1988, and 80% of which were linked to the Greater London Council. So each of these political murals was painted within feet of Brixton's front line, or the area which saw the most activity during the 1981 uprising. And the location and themes of these artworks aided in drawing attention to the minority community's counter-narrative by providing these canvases to critique the hegemony of traditional British society. So supported and protected by the radical policies of the GLC, which was taken over by the New Left and Red Ken Livingstone in 1981, muralists covered the walls of central Brixton with these anti-conservative images, reminding passers-by how these Thatcherite ideologies were harmful to their community and the larger British nation. So in June of 1985, the GLC announced that 4 anti-racist murals would be painted in areas of London, which, quote, either have large Black or ethnic minority communities or have experienced racial conflict. And this was in order to celebrate the GLC-sponsored London Anti-Racist Year. This Brixton mural, titled The Dreamer, the Rumor, and the Poet's Song, was painted by South African artist Gavin Jantes and Dominican-born artist Tam Joseph. The 75-foot mural was inspired by Picasso's Guernica and narrated the story of the post-war story of Brixton's Black community. So the left side of the mural over here depicts the dream of those who immigrated to the UK, leaving behind their families for a promise of work and a better life. The center section depicts the reality and the struggle of Black Brixtonians, specifically displaying negative interactions between Black citizens and the police. 2 figures can be seen in shackles, one behind prison bars and another prone on the ground with a white boot on their neck. A Black figure sobs openly at the brutal treatment of these fellow Black bodies, while others flee a burning home, a reference to the New Cross fire, where the death of 13 Black British youths went ignored by the police and the government. The right side of the mural, the end of the story, depicts a poet figure based on famous poet Linton Kwesi Johnson, reciting the story of Brixton to a group of youths. The inclusion of this figure implies that the struggles of the Black community will never be forgotten. Jantes announced how he had no personal aims for the mural, as the artwork was meant to represent the struggle of the community rather than his own personal experience as a Black man. He and Joseph attended various meetings with community leaders and Brixton organizations to settle on a mural theme, and the GLC held a public unveiling of the design so community members could comment on the artwork before it went on the wall. The mural is explicitly political, blatantly depicting the counter-narrative to the conservative criminalized ideology. The artwork contests the racist ideology of Britain being swamped by immigrants incapable of assimilating into white society. Jantes stated that the subject of the mural, quote, comes from the engagement I have with the people of Brixton, including the police, issues of creativity, issues of police harassment, immigration, street riots, and violence, issues of people wanting to change their environment. And I will say that Jantes and Joseph had their own interaction with the police. The GLC rented them a Cadillac to drive them around when they were trying to find locations for their mural. And as you couldn't suspect, they were stopped multiple times by the police while driving around Brixton and in a GLC car looking for places to paint this mural. So while there are no police figures painted in the mural, the artwork has vivid illustrations of the counter-narrative claims of over-policing. And this was something flagged by Metropolitan Police officers who, according to Jantes, visited the artists while they were painting in, quote, a tremendous attempt at trying to convince the local public that they were on their side. The police recognized the power of this large, colorful public display and the over-policing counter-narrative, and their increased patrolling schedule on Railton Road during the mural's painting exhibits, in my opinion, the mural's success confronting Britain's racist history of over-policing. Jantes argues that, quote, murals in London were exciting. They were a sign of resisting racism and inequality. The core of Black people's relationship to the visual arts is about Black reality and visibility. And bringing representational visual art to the streets of Brixton during the 1980s, community murals provided these large public canvases for which residents could bring visibility to their counter-narrative and their lived reality as Black British citizens. And you'll see down on the bottom, I have a couple of photos. So this mural is in this place called Dexter Square. So it's kind of a gathering spot. It's right off Railton Road. So there was a lot of violence here during 1981, and there would be a lot of violence in the next coming months because this was painted only a couple months before there's another uprising in 1985. But the other photo I have here, I love, is from one of these block parties, right? Where they would hand out, kids would have balloons, they'd do face painting, there'd be food, music, really a great time. So shifting now kind of to maybe images more familiar for everybody in the room, the creation and implementation of community arts was very different in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of Britain. So in an outbreak of frankness, community arts in Northern Ireland, Heather Floyd and Chris Ball argue that during the 1960s, quote, the notion of community arts was virtually, if not entirely, unheard of in Northern Ireland. It was not until the late 1970s that community arts, or at least the notion of arts for all, received statutory recognition and funding as a discrete and distinct area of the arts. So the Arts Council for Ireland did receive funding for community arts in the late 1970s, but the organization seemed suspicious of art created specifically for individual communities, arguing that, quote, community arts enslaved to any minority ideology will simply cultivate yet another minority interest. And the arts group instead wanted to focus on bringing high art to the lower class or deprived areas. And this led to the exact fear of the community arts movement, having artists parachuted into urban areas to create art that people or communities not necessarily wanted. When muralists in locations like Brixton developed specific government funding methods to create community artworks, successful community murals only arose in Belfast after a failed state-sponsored mural scheme. The imposition on community creativity, combined with the support for the 1981 Republican hunger strike, led to an explosion of minority community murals, all of which depicted the Republican community's counter-narrative to criminalization. So during Belfast's short-lived but ultimately unsuccessful government-sponsored mural scheme, it was decided that the city, quote, would not seek to impose any artistic limitations on the design of murals, but the artist should be made aware of the need to avoid paintings of a political or sectarian interpretation. So City Hall decided it would have the final approval over designs painted by art school students who were openly not community artists. Now, again, these poor art school students answered basically an ad that said, do you want to put your art on the wall? And all of them said yes. And then many of them came here and found out that they were supposed to actually be doing community art, which involved engaging in the community, which many of them were not prepared for. So it's no judgment on the art students. They did their best. And they were kind of forced to paint generic imagery approved of by the city. And many students end up painting what the community called Mickey Mouse murals. So these murals depicted fairy tales or exotic destinations. So in this attempt to create imagery that promoted a normalized Belfast, these murals disregarded the issues impacting Republican areas, problems that were rooted in sectarian politics and criminalization. One of the student muralists argued that while graffiti and slogan painting were prevalent on the walls of Belfast before the city council began funding murals, these failed state-sponsored murals inspired the shift in Republican murals. They said, quote, I don't think it's just a coincidence. I think that the fact that we were producing state-sponsored murals before that, people could see the impact. They turned from the written word to the visual image. So these unrepresentative government-sponsored murals led to the illegal creation of murals in Republican areas of Belfast. These murals were painted by untrained and mostly anonymous artists with donated materials in a matter of hours or days. And these illegal artworks were not celebrated with street parties upon completion. Instead, many of them were often paint bombed by the police, the army, or opposing forces. Between 1981 and 1989, there were at least 125 murals. I say at least because that is what I have record of. There were probably more, but I have at least a record of 125. And these murals fell into 6 distinct categories, depicting hunger strikers, gunmen, flags and symbols, historical figures and mythological events, claims of international solidarity, and civil rights abuses against minority populations. Each of these 6 themes was used to justify the Republican argument that the problems in Northern Ireland stemmed from Britain's colonial legacy on the island, and they all successfully displayed the counter-narrative to criminalization in Belfast throughout the 1980s. So I wanted to go through a couple of themes, and I will say that on this slide I do have highlighted. So these are a couple of gunmen and international solidarity murals. This mural on the bottom is one from the city scheme. So this one is called Gulliver's Travels. It was painted in '77, and this was one that Belfast City Hall required the artist to change. It's supposed to be a scene where the figure jumps over the horizon line, and the artist wanted to make the horizon line orange and this figure in the front green that kind of is shaking its fist, and it was deemed that that would be too upsetting or too political of a theme. So Belfast City Hall made the artist change it, and they have a really great quote where the students say that they were held up by the red tape of the green dome, which I feel is a very art student quote, right? So it's beautiful, but it's a very art student quote. So you can see kind of what I talk about, the kind of censorship of Belfast City Hall is happening in these murals, which is not at all happening in these other murals. So murals in Belfast muralists came from within the minority community. Owing to the contested nature of space in the city, there's little chance for some unknown artist to put up an artwork on the Falls Road. The majority of the chosen mural topics came from a different type of community collaboration, as these artists were enmeshed in local Republican activism. And while there was no structured community meetings or votes on the mural imagery or what this mural imagery should look like, muralists argued that they consulted their community about what to paint. So muralist Danny Devaney argued, quote, "It wasn't that we were superimposing murals. We know what people wanted. We were living with them on a daily basis. We were talking with them in their taxis and in their community centers. We were sitting with them at bars at night. And a lot of the inspiration for stuff that we put on the murals has come from those conversations." So opponents of these murals often challenge the validity of them as community artworks, instead arguing that these displays were forced, sometimes with threats of violence, on unsupportive citizens, to which Devaney would argue that he and his fellow muralists always asked before painting houses, saying, quote, "You wouldn't find any forced murals in nationalist areas. You don't need to. It's about giving people respect. It's not that Belfast is lacking wall space. You can simply paint it elsewhere." These murals depicted the political reality that Belfast community dealt with on a day-to-day basis, the political reality of criminalization, which these state-sponsored murals often ignored. And since I don't have time to cover all 6 of the themes in depth, I wanted to highlight the theme that many argue began the mural movement in Belfast minority community, and the theme that I think has the best visual examples of criminalization policies. So I'm going to start with hunger strike murals. So there were at least 24 hunger strike murals painted in 1981 alone. Again, that number is just the ones that I can find record of. I'm assuming there are more. Some of these murals depicted the face of Sands or his fellow strikers, while others showed generic figures. These men were often surrounded by religious imagery and Republican symbols, linking them to the Irish martyrs of the nationalist past. Specific or generic, these murals were extremely successful at refuting the argument of inherent criminality in the Republican community, instead depicting a people struggling to the death to combat an oppressive government. And while the narrative of state-sponsored criminalization refused to recognize the political nature of these Republican struggles, these images portrayed the Republican struggle as one of higher than politics of biblical proportion. So Father Des Wilson, who would later facilitate peace discussions, explained the power of these images, saying that, quote, "The hunger striker was shown in his cell, prostrate, suffering, enduring. In the end, if the hunger striker should die, he had in a strange way triumphed, because he had endured suffering while his tormentor only caused it, death with honor." 2 young muralists argued that this theme blatantly drew comparisons between, quote, Jesus dying Calvary and the men dying on hunger strike, and that both of these people were dying because they believed what they were doing was right. So from Sands' smiling face to the withered bodies of generic striking figures, from the busts of the Ted Den men to the lists of their names, from proclamations of Smash the H to slogans like Don't Let Them Die, these murals exploded across Belfast in 1981, each a canvas for the Republican counter-narrative of injustice. The number of artworks depicting strikes dwindled after the end of the strike, but the impact of these community artworks did not diminish. Muralist Mohara summed up the importance of this theme, stating that, quote, 1981 was the very first time the nationalist community had the courage and the confidence to get up and paint murals. If the hunger strikers were laying down for us for our freedom, why can we not, as Republicans, as Catholics, as nationalists, fight for the freedom of our country? Why can't we use murals to express it? These are the other 2 themes that I won't be talking about today specifically, because just symbols, murals with symbols and flags, and history murals, but I have to show them because we treat all mural themes respectfully, so they don't know that I have favorites. So that's why they're on here. We're just a sampling of other murals. But what I wanted to kind of focus on is this last theme, which made up roughly 13% of the total murals painted in the 1980s, which is the theme of civil rights violations. And I believe that this best provided direct visual evidence to the Republican counter-narrative against criminalization. So these artworks provided pictorial interpretations of what the Republicans saw as wrongdoings by the British government and Northern Ireland's majority community, from violence enacted on citizens by the army or the RUC, to the unlawful obtaining of confessions, to prison brutality, to the imposed censorship ban forced on the minority community. These painted walls provided canvases through which to display the Republican counter-narrative to the world. So I wanted to highlight a pair of murals painted by a young muralist named Kez on Beachmount Avenue in 1981. The top one is called The Training Ground and the bottom one, The Conveyor Belt. These murals combine to tell a two-part story of oppression in Northern Ireland, beginning with The Training Ground, which was based on a 1979 linotype, which detailed centuries of English involvement in Ireland. Kez found the image on a book cover and stated that, quote, the artwork starts with Cromwell's men coming in, the guns start raising, then the B specials who were legalized, who were supposed to be disbanded. What they did was to give them paramilitary uniforms. They called them the UDR, then they remake the B specials. So Kez is drawing this historical linkage to the displayed kind of militaristic progression, beginning with the four Cromwellian figures on the left and ending with the contemporary RUC officer on the right. Each figure is participating in an attack on what appears to be a defenseless figure. The historical and the modern are linked with the depictions of the Ulster banner behind these actions, creating an unbroken colonial legacy of violence. And this long history of civil rights violations is supposed to implied in this mural is meant to make the state-sponsored narrative of criminalization more difficult to accept. So the training ground on the top morphs into the second mural, which depicts the steps of criminalization metaphorically dubbed the conveyor belt, which included arrest under sus, extended detainment in a military barracks, a trial in a diplock court, and the arrival of a minority community in the H blocks of Long Kesh. In each step of the process, the figure is mentally and physically broken down by various government personnel, while on certain points in the conveyor belt, the figure appears to have given up, overwhelmed by the mechanisms of state suppression. In the end, he raises in protest inside of the H block, refusing to give in to the colonial process of subjugation. The imagery of this unidentifiable youth being brutalized, humiliated, and eventually radicalized by the very government that strove to oppress him provides a pictorial micro and macrocosm for the minority community in Northern Ireland, explaining how both individual Republicans and the entire minority community seem to suffer under British occupation. And when asked about the community's reaction to the mural, Kez described how the community saw the civil rights violation depicted in the mural happening in real time as the mural is painted. He said, quote, when we were doing it, they seen Brits harassing us. They say, those lads are only painting the walls right, doing it right, and the Brits is out. And every time we were out doing the walls, it's right, what's your names, messing us about. And when the wall mural finished, they throw paint at it. And it was dead certain that we were out the next day painting again. It was bringing it home to people that they were animals, that they were harassing us, because they were seeing it every day and we were out doing something. And the West Belfast community appeared to embrace both murals and their message against British colonial legacy and civil rights. Even though both murals were paint bombs during the first year that they were created, the artworks were touched up and remained on Beachmont Avenue till the end of the decade. So while created via very different artistic and collaborative methods as the murals of Brixton, the murals of Belfast became activist tools through which the community could simultaneously oppose this post-colonial narrative and the law and order government while highlighting their narrative, essentially the same goal the murals of Brixton attempted to achieve. As Danny Devaney explained following the hunger strike, quote, the whole community had come together. I don't know if it was just confidence, but now we weren't going to do things the same way. And the murals were part of that confidence, and we found it in ourselves. They were saying, this is our message, and we know we're right. And while these 1980s artworks painted by community muralists in each location have been previously examined by academics in various fields, the murals of Brixton and Belfast have never really been analyzed together as part of a larger community mural movement. Muralists working in both the Republic and Black communities in these cities viewed their art as stemming from the same artistic movement, and community mural publication from the 1980s discussed these artworks as part of a same movement that was, quote, freely accessible to the people in their movement against real sexual and economic oppression. That's a quote from the Community Murals magazine, but also Circa talks about these murals in the same way. Individual community muralists in both Belfast and Brixton drew connections between their artwork. Some even traveled to see the murals of their fellow artists during the 1980s. And since the end of the 1980s, muralist solidarity between these two locations has only increased. So these artworks have always been examined as kind of separate mural movements, divorcing not only the murals of these communities, but furthering the inaccurate belief that the struggle of both the Black and Republican communities have nothing in common. So Black and Republican community members understood that the allegations of criminality and the hard policing tactics deployed to curb this criminality stemmed from the negative impacts of Britain's post-colonial crisis of hegemony. The 1981 Brixton Uprising and the 1981 Belfast hunger strike were the result of common criminalization tactics. Community muralists in Belfast and Brixton understood the artwork they created to be part of the same global mural movement, which strove to provide disenfranchised peoples with a public form of visual representation. Both locations used community murals as subversive tools to spatially and visually challenge the established hegemonic forces by providing canvases to display a counter-narrative and a culture of both minority communities. And by focusing on community-created sources, both textual and visual, my hope is that my work highlights how the shared activism, anti-policing protests, and artwork of Brixton and Belfast were intertwined, creating solidarity between these minority groups during the 70s and 80s. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much. And we'll open it up for questions and comments. So we have an audience online. So look, we'll monitor any questions that are coming to us online, either raise your hand digitally or type your question into the comments, whatever you prefer. Obviously, the audience in the room. Adrian, let's start.
Yeah, sorry, can you give me a little space to develop an argument, Peter, if you may? I love comparisons. I think comparisons are wonderful, and I hate people who don't like comparisons. So I'm completely on this side in the value of making comparisons. I think there's some more people who've done comparisons than you may be aware of in this kind of area, like Paddy Hilliard talking about suspect communities, comparing kind of the impact of terrorism laws on different Irish communities as well as Black and Muslim communities in Britain. So there is actually more comparative work.
Please, if you know them, hit me up.
So Paddy Hilliard's the name.
Gotcha.
Suspect
communities, you said?
Suspect communities is a big concept.
Gotcha.
People getting treated as suspect communities. But let me tackle this issue of criminalization, because criminalization is doing quite a lot of work in your analysis, and it really means some rather different things, and this is quite problematic, because criminalization can be quite a benign thing. It can be the idea that people should not be charged with anything which isn't an actual crime, that the law should be applied to everybody, and also that normal politics, peaceful politics of whatever it's arguing for, should not be criminalized, should not be made a crime. So the criminalization of peaceful activity shows where there's a problem with the word criminalization, because criminalization can both mean literally operating a rule of law model, but it can also be used as Putin criminalizing his opponents, which clearly isn't a rule of law model. So there's a problem about that. Now, in terms of how the criminalization issue arose in Northern Ireland, you've associated it with Thatcher, but actually Thatcher is a person who abandons it. In a sense, the criminalization phase in Northern Ireland was a very brief phase that existed in the period after the Ulster Workers' Council strike. What happened was, after the Ulster Workers' Council strike in 1974, the British government despaired of the possibility of achieving any kind of political settlement easily. Prior to that, the line had been, we can do anything under emergency. We can say this is an emergency. If there's an emergency, you can suspend normal habeas corpus, you can intern people without trial, you can do what you like, because you're also trying to address the issue politically through initiatives and negotiations. You're trying to find a political solution while also operating emergency laws. Once you reach a point where you feel you can't find a political solution, you can no longer justify emergencies. After all, the very term emergency applies something not normal, something short term. So the British government after 74 was faced with the inability actually to find a political solution. but having to continue to govern the place in some way and maintain some semblance of order. And to do so, they opted for the notion of criminalization, which meant the heavy-handed kind of security measures actually diminished. So you had the primacy of the police, which meant a much softer approach. The British Army was much, much harder than the RUC in treatment of people. So you got, and you had the ending of internment without trial. That was a massive issue, removing internment. A massive grievance was removed. Now that didn't, you could say that phase of criminalization didn't work. And what came in, when Thatcher came in, she had a different approach to dealing with the problem of, how do you legitimize British rule absence anything happening? And she went the Anglo-Irish route. She went the route of negotiations with Hawking, and then ultimately the Anglo-Irish agreement with Gatwick. So that was a way of going over the heads of the local politicians and legitimizing what the British were doing in Northern Ireland via the Irish Republic. And that also meant a much freer hand to use counterinsurgency methods, SAS, all these other kinds of things that could be used in the context of saying we are addressing the political stability situation through the superimposed. So I think the word criminalization can be used sort of slightly propagandistically without kind of this nuance that it can be used both for authoritarian governments, which are criminalizing normal peaceful activity, and also criminalization as simply meaning the eschewing of kind of extraordinary measures in terms of oppressing kind of political parties for their viewpoints and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in a kind of a way, Thatcher was much freer to use extraordinary methods because she had the Anglo-Irish kind of dimension. It was actually a sort of rather weak government that applied the strategy of criminalization during a limited period which predates your great flowering of, because of course the hunger strike came after this.
Yes,
period.
no,
the actual classic period of criminalization is the late 70s.
Yes, the late starts in 1976. Yes,
okay.
no,
I
I completely understand, and I appreciate that, and because it was something that I had to make sure in my work that I distinguish between, right, and I would say to your comment that that's why I have left the word criminalization to be broad. So I completely understand your distinction, but I'm using it as a broad umbrella term. So it does in fact mean the kind of both you're implying the idea of peaceful activity and the kind of the using extreme measures, and I am using that as both. So it's not that I think that criminalization started with Margaret Thatcher in Northern Ireland. I'm arguing that the idea of criminalization as a larger umbrella term happened, and you can compare those two larger umbrella terms from kind of the Black community in Britain from the 50s, and in the Republican community, you can really start in the 20s and move on forward, right? Which is why I specifically highlight the Murals start under Thatcher and directs a lot of their anger at Margaret Thatcher and her policies. But I understand your comment and I appreciate it. I will make sure that in further work, I make my broader term more specific. And I appreciate the other book because I didn't know about that one. So thank you for that.
Okay, sorry.
No, sorry.
So first of all, it's only comment, kind of a question sort of thing. I'm doing murals as well, but loyalist murals. So this is quite interesting.
I've been looking for your email online and I can't find it anywhere. It's telling you that I'm here.
I can't remember if it was Bill Ralston or Neil Jarman who had said that murals in Northern Ireland very much started as a loyalist thing. So I'm kind of really fascinated. What's your kind of feelings on Republican communities reclaiming murals? Kind of seeing what the loyalists were doing and being like, yeah, we're going to do that, but we're going to do the things that you talk about, so international solidarity, hunger strikers. And in that sort of vein, you kind of briefly touched on it, but the whole government funding into murals, I think, is very spicy. in a very unacademic way. So what was kind of, I think I'd be really interested in hearing a bit more about your thoughts on that as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so government funding on which mural? The ones in Brixton or?
The ones in Brixton.
Yeah. So, well, you can ask Bill, who's in the back, if he what he meant. Hi, Bill. I would have to say that none of my work would be possible without Bill, who I just emailed today about his great exhibition at the Ulster Museum, which everyone should go see if you haven't. But yeah, so yeah, Loyalist murals have a much longer tradition, right? Going back to the early 1900s. Sometimes some people argue even earlier than that, but mainly the early 1900s. A lot of murals on dockyards, where they're painted around kind of King Billy murals, so there is a much longer Loyalist mural tradition. But obviously it comes from a very different place than these murals come from, just like the murals in Brixton kind of come from this very different place. So yeah, government funding in Brixton is actually really interesting because the majority of the muralists who are part of the community mural movement would self-identify kind of as part of the new left, right? Because kind of ascribe to all of these rising radical policies of the 60s, and they are a big fan of the Greater London Council, like the GLC, which is the body that is kind of in charge of the day-to-day running of London, and in the 80s is also taken over by Red Ken Livingston, right? And I have to say his nickname because I think it's one of the greatest nicknames that's ever existed. I would love to have a rhyming nickname that everyone historically knew me by. But so there was already kind of this government funding for community arts kind of going around in the late 60s into the 70s. But what ends up happening is the rise of mural movement in London kind of coincides with this government takeover of the GLC. And it also coincides with the kind of rise of Thatcher's government. And the GLC is just kind of like a big screw you. They're basically at war the whole time with the Thatcher government, and Margaret Thatcher eventually wins that war because she disbands the GLC in the late 80s. But so there are a lot of kind of different bodies of the GLC that are taking government funding for these product projects, for various murals, for other art, kind of community art projects, for a really unfortunately named ethnic arts and ethnic minority arts kind of council that's giving funding to a lot of the Black artists that are creating art at this time. So they're funding plays, they're funding gallery shows, and the community muralists are tapping into this. So the community muralists in London are essentially, that's really their career. So a lot of them set up workshops. So they make like banners for marches, they make these murals, and the only way that they fund them is through government funding. It's the only way that they eat, realistically. So the government funding is substantial as compared to, you know, what we would think even probably today for a government-sponsored art project. But yeah, it's super interesting because a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that the GLC is kind of going to war over economic spending with Margaret Thatcher. And when they eventually do close the GLC, they basically decide to just throw money at everything in the late 80s, to the point where they really say, what is the thing that we can do that will most upset the Thatcher government? And they, I'm not kidding, they have a whole party celebrating the commemoration of Terence McSweeney. And it's like they pour thousands and thousands of pounds into this block party that they're like, if we're going out in style. So it coincides with the government funding coincides kind of with this perfect time, this perfect rise of kind of municipal funding for arts. But yeah, you and I got to talk later.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fascinating. And this is maybe slightly unfair because your periodization is really clear, but it just struck me when you said you think about turning this into a book. Like and I'm using the wrong terms here, but this kind of grassroots versus arts council mural divide, I think is still a thing in Belfast. Like on Sunday, there was the big block party where they have and some of those are quote unquote political. There's like queer rights murals or Ukraine murals down there, but they're not the same as like you walk around the same areas in West Belfast now and it's the same murals. Whereas like in Brixton, this is complete gentrification and a lot of those communities have been displaced, and the murals in Brixton now will be like David Bowie or whatever. They're not quite as political. So just wondering if you've thought about, do you think about bringing it up to now and making any of those comparisons with kind of you know, I just think in a book that would be like a nice little, you know,
Yeah.
epilogue or something.
No, it's funny you say that because that's how my dissertation ends. Yeah, no, you make a really great point. So I always argue there are lots of people, especially when I go to conferences, that kind of want to give papers that they're like, oh, the murals in Belfast City Centre today are non-political, and I'm like, there's no such thing. Like I feel like I start to my eye starts to twitch. There can be a such thing as a non-political mural, but it can't be in a place where murals are political. It's just non-existent. So yeah, no, I agree with you. What's interesting is so the two I bring up here. So these are more recent kind of murals. So these are from 2011, 2012, right? So this one on the right is actually Danny DeVenny, Marty Lyons, and Mark Irvin, who's a royalist muralist, who went to New Cross. And basically where the site of the New Cross fire was, and they painted a mural to kind of for that, and also for the Stephen Lawrence Foundation, right? So Stephen Lawrence is a Black man who was shot by the police in the 90s, and so his mother is an activist, and so they kind of went and painted this mural, and then they brought his mother over to Fail and Fable, and they made more anti-racist murals on the International Wall and other places in 2012, and so these murals do continue, right? So the solidarity also continues up until kind of very recently. So in Brixton in 2001, for the 40-year anniversary of the uprising, there's actually a whole kind of smattering of political murals. So Brixton also still does both, right? So both still exist. Kind of, so both the kind of community murals, the murals of celebration, right, which would be, the David Bowie type ones. There's some really kind of beautiful artworks there. There's a really beautiful Black Panther one there after Chadwick Boseman died, right? So there's still kind of these murals of community celebration, but also still political murals in Brixton. And obviously, as you just pointed out, as Bill still points out every day, there are also still murals right here in a mural tradition. And I think that the kind of the split, I don't think there can be a non-political mural, honestly, in either place. Yeah, right. So the periodization is cut off because I had to come up for air at some point. I said, no, we're just doing the 80s. But yeah, so the dissertation ends, and I think that you serve a great point, is that I would love to bring it kind of forward and talk about the kind of continuing solidarity between kind of muralists. One of the muralists that just came for the Painting the North thing this weekend that you mentioned is actually one of the very prominent muralists in and around London. And he makes these beautiful artworks. He just recently put one in Brixton of celebrating powerful Black women. So it was like a 9 mural citywide kind of thing, and one he put in Brixton. So he always puts a mural in Brixton when he does kind of these artworks celebrating Black culture. There's always one that he puts in Brixton. He was just here this past weekend. So your point is phenomenal, and I'm glad that someone else doesn't think I'm crazy when I as the historian be like, and this week in 2024, my research is still valuable. Please, someone. But thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. Just a wee quick point. I'm pretty sure that's my granddad in one of those pictures. Getting stopped in the state. It's a wee quick point. But the other point, is there any comparison between like the other metropolitan authorities? I know you mentioned like the GLC, but with like other authorities who were getting their rates capped at the time, such as like Merseyside, like so there was a taxes rates at the time. So is there any comparison in their murals?
No, again, that's a super great question. I had to cap it to London. There is, I can't answer that question like truthfully and honestly about the specific what kind of funding was going to community arts, because I haven't looked into it. I know that it was. I know because the GLC was kind of helping other metropolitan authorities kind of work through these like applications. Right, so the GLC, what I know that they were producing was kind of these pamphlets that they kind of made as like a how-to for other authorities, and some of them were on things like race-related issues, kind of gender-related issues, how they were like putting things together, and part of that was also asking the government for funding for community art, municipal art, things like that. So I don't know what the funding would have looked like in other places, but there are obviously uprisings in plenty of other places across the 80s. And I do know that almost each of them, again, please don't quote me on this, and this is a question, don't tell Kieran, oh, I said this out loud, but I would be shocked if there was a place that there was an uprising in the 80s that also then didn't have some sort of community artwork project that was probably funded. Whether or not how much funding it got would be based on who was controlling those metropolitan authorities, right? And I will also say that my focus is Brixton. I'd like to, in the future, expand to London, because there's a lot, I think, of connections just within the London area or right outside kind of the London area where there's an incident and then community art kind of blossoms or murals occur. But I'd love to expand it outward even further. It's just, you know, based on time and research. So I don't have a specific answer for you that you can quote me on, but I would be shocked. I do know that the GLC was giving advice to other municipal authorities on how to kind of work the system, if you will, while the conservative national government was running. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Rachel, I like your starting point about the comparison, and nobody makes the comparison well enough. So you're on absolutely solid ground there. I'm gonna take that away now.
Hit me, Bill.
At the risk of sounding like you're surrounded by a whole pile of old professors who just want to criticize you. I think that every comparison requires an abstraction, because no two things are alike, or identical, sorry. So the question is, how far do you abstract? And is there a point where you abstract so far that you're actually doing an injustice to the specificity of each? So that's always the tension in making comparisons. So just, I'm not saying you are doing an injustice to the specificity, but just in relation to that in Belfast, number one, the claim by the City Council and the Arts Council and the students on that late 70s community mural scheme that they inspired the Republican mural movement. I don't think that holds up. The most I think that it did was to say to people, oh look, you can paint the walls. And that was just about it. I've never heard anybody say, oh yeah, I was inspired to go out and paint about Bobby Sands because I saw Humpty Dumpty on the wall for the new lodge. So
there was Humpty.
So I think that's exaggerated. One thing that Republican muralists sometimes say, and I think that from another point of view, they exaggerate it slightly, but it doesn't mean it's untrue. It's an element of truth to it, is that an influence on them deciding to paint was what was coming out of the prisons. Because remember, people were doing artwork in prisons. And in fact, Bobby Sands did write at one point, he wrote a column out to people saying, look, you've got to start a big mural painting campaign. This is going to raise the profile. And prisoners, I've seen some of them, I've got two of them myself, where they sent out suggestions for murals. So that's a factor that's in there too. So I'm just also on the other point about specificity. You showed the mural of the three women and the International Women's Day symbol, you know, and that was painted by Kes, whom you mentioned, and by a woman.
Andrea Redmond, right?
Andrea is the only person I've met in all the years painting murals in Belfast who came to mural painting with arts training. The only one, right? One other person got arts training afterwards, but after he'd done 20 years of mural painting. But only one came to it that way. And that's a completely different scenario from what was happening, but not just with London, but the community mural scheme worldwide, actually. The main instigation of the community mural scheme worldwide was artists saying they wanted to put their walls, they wanted the walls to be their gallery. They wanted to get their art out in the street and not to be esoteric and everything else. So I'm just saying, I'm sorry.
No.
Two quick things. Number one, no, it wasn't me, or it wasn't
Neil Jarman.
It wasn't Neil Jarman. It was actually Belinda Loftus was the first person who put a date saying 1908. The first mural. She was the one who came up with that research. And Stephen Lawrence was knifed by.
So no, I'm Bill. All of your points are great, and you're correct, right? And so I had to condense, right, for the purpose of the presentation rather than the dissertation and or hope for the book. But no, you're correct. I think that it's I will be more, you are correct, and I'm glad that you flagged that. I will be kind of more specific. I do think that it's a combination, right? So it's kind of my answer to you about it's the perfect storm of kind of all three things kind of being created, because there you have these murals that are going up, that are allowed to go up, that the government is given money to go up, and I will say that I find it wildly ironic that the state-sponsored murals actually come from the campaign that goes with criminalization, the official campaign of criminalization, which is normalization, right? So it's literally a part of trying to normalize Belfast to make it look kind of as a place that people could pour money into, that could do business in. And they're like, what says, please invest in our city, like a mural, right? So the idea to kind of put these murals up, and it's not necessarily that, and Phil said they literally painted Humpty Dumpty in some of them. They literally painted like jungle themes, and I think it's I don't know if it's the issue of Circa runs in 1983, kind of Circa runs a whole issue of these murals, and one of the quotes basically says that the kids of Belfast give the murals their greatest addition, which is they put inappropriate things all over these murals, right? So if you painted a mural of like Humpty Dumpty or a deer in a forest, the next day you would come back and there'd be like genitals all over it, and they were like, that was the reaction. So I think it's that combination of giving state-sponsored funds to muralists who, again, were brought in, again, very nice art student kids who were brought in, allowed to paint the walls in a way that minority community members were not, plus all of the artwork, as you said. I think the Bobby Sands quote is a painting spree that will cover the countryside or something along those lines. It's that call in combination with the fact that walls could be painted, right? They just weren't allowed to, right? So it's all a combination, but I will 100% in the actual work, it's teased out more. But thank you for flagging that I will be more specific in those kind of suggestions or points when I talk about them.
Okay, look, anything online?
Yeah. So Stuart Thompson says, interesting and entertaining presentation. I have a couple of comments which might be questions. Number one, is there an issue to be addressed about who speaks for the community, both in Brixton and West Belfast? And number two, what's the relationship, if any, between banners, marching banners, trade union banners, on the one hand, and then quasi-murals of advertising posters, sometimes sharing nearby wall space? The Brake Thatcher's back mural has a Guinness advert above it. I'm reminded of Naomi Klein's No logo with its call for defacing adverts and brand names as a sort of counter-hegemonic maneuver.
Spot on. One second, I'm just murals and advert. Yeah. So first, for your first question, yeah, absolutely. There is part of my work is really difficult with kind of defining who speaks for a community. So I'm really working with AP Cohen's definition of community, which basically makes the argument that a community realistically is, because it's non-monolithic, it has to be by those who identify with it, but also it really is a thing for Cohen that marks people as the same but different than, right? So a community, both of these communities are not always going to have the same opinion. There are some instances of people not agreeing on certain things. So the idea of who speaks for the community is a hard one to kind of wrap your head around. I've basically gone with the idea that if there was any kind of instance of community discussion of whether or not something shouldn't be there, a mural shouldn't be there, or there were instances of a mural being vandalized, those got put in, and that did happen. So I do make kind of the point, right, that the mural that Jean-Tace and Tam Joseph paint for the GLC anti-racist year. So the GLC basically kind of runs this open campaign to put all the designs, they put them in a booklet beforehand, a printed out booklet, and have this big party for people to comment. And there's 4 murals, and one of the other murals the community does comment on. The mural it's got a depiction of a West Indian family barricaded in their home watching a Margaret Thatcher speech on TV, and there was a figure that is bald and looks like a skinhead kind of gesturing threateningly at the door. And because there had been instances of extreme right-wing groups firebombing people's apartments, right, that these West Indian families lived in. And so the community actually basically said kind of the same thing they said to Stephen Pousset's mural, was that mural would be too problematic for them because it would cause more harm than it would do good. And so they had the muralists change it. And so they went to the GLC and they said, we can't do this theme. we need to change it, and she did, right? There were also instances of some of the other mural themes I put up were made for an anti-nuclear year, and some of those murals in London were moved because the community said, we don't want this mural here, and it was moved. I don't have any cases, and maybe Bill would. I know from the Republican muralist painters that I've spoken to, and again, take this with a grain of salt, because they're the ones painting the murals, that there was only one that they could kind of come up with that I think was a mural that both Danny Morrison and Danny Devaney talked to me about the same mural that they thought someone painted, a youth group for Sinn Féin painted, that kind of had an attitude of like a haha got you kind of moment that they felt was too celebratory after some incidents of violence occurred in the loyalist community. And so people came to them and said, this isn't what we want, you have to take it down. And they did take it down. So on the issue of who speaks for the community, I can only put in the dissertation, and have tried to only put in what the community seems to accept. And if they've had any issues about it, I've tried to flag that. But it is a difficult kind of process that I'm trying to work through, and hopefully do work through. And as for the question on banners and marches, banners and murals and adverts, they definitely go hand in hand. So the mural community, the mural groups in Brixton are often also making banners. This is also part of their kind of, so Carol Kenna and Stephen Lobb have probably the most famous kind of mural workshop. It's called the Greenwich Mural Workshop, and they're not only painting murals, but they're making banners. They're making banners for anti-fascist marches. They're making banners for pro-immigration marches, for gendered marches, for anti-nuclear marches. So these banners coincide. And obviously the idea of what you paint on a wall coincides here with banners and marches as well. And the idea of adverts is actually really interesting, because this is one of the kind of huge issues, because Bill brought up kind of the global community mural movement, and issues of adverts is really interesting because the global community mural movement basically has this argument that if a business or someone can pay to put up an advert in what they think is the public space and impose that on the public, one, why can't someone tag it, right? Why can't somebody come and spray paint over it? How is that any different? Because a company is forcing their what they want into the public sphere, and the public has no choice on it. So why can't someone tag it? And also the idea that you can't put up a mural anywhere. Why is it that, you know, Coca-Cola can put up their advert and you have to live with that in your neighborhood, but you can't put up a mural? So there's definitely a kind of combination here of banners, of murals, and adverts all kind of competing for who's going to have control over the public sphere. So those are great questions. Thank you.
And if I could just maybe follow up on that issue of who speaks for the community and how that's reflected in murals. I mean, it's kind of notorious within kind of loyalist communities. The kind of two major, three perhaps, but possibly three major loyalist organizations have and continue to create murals which are competitive within the community as to who speaks on behalf of the community, which are about kind of territorial demarcation within the loyalist community as much as they are about projection to others outside it. So my question really is to what extent that's reflected in the period you're looking at within republicanism. I mean, 1981, the hunger strikes is potentially a period of kind of Republican ecumenism, because both INLA and the official IRA are operating collectively in that, but that doesn't last, you know. So who speaks for the community on the Republican side going forward after 1981 is contested, not just between the provisionals and INLA, but also from 1986, the Republican Sinn Féin, which is the obviously originator, but becomes a much larger dissident movement in the 1990s. My question really is this reflected in street politics, if you like, not just a kind of simple confrontation between the community and the state, but between factions within the community as to who actually represents it?
No, again, a super great question. And it's also, again, the reason why, like, I've tried to use, because of the differences and the nuance, I've tried to use the broadest version of criminalization I can. I've tried to use the broadest version of community, right, that I can. So you probably noticed I've used the phrase minority community, right, a lot, instead of trying to kind of hunker down and specify, because there are different, again, it's not, no community is a monolith, and there are different kind of ideas and different people in each community. I can't draw a line for you of when that would occur, or if it occurs in the 80s, that there's any kind of split. I will say that I do think that because of their involvement in kind of organizing mural painting, Sinn Féin ends up being more represented, mainly because they have a youth mural painting wing. So they are very invested in, and I can't find out, and maybe Bill knows, I can't find out who organized that, like if Sinn Féin organized it, or if actually like a group of young kids just got together and said, we are now the Sinn Féin youth mural painting movement. But so like artists like Kez and Marty Lyons would have been kind of a part of this quasi-organized movement, but I can't, off the top of my head, think of any specific mural that is signed or funded by like the INLA or something like that, but I do know plenty of murals that are signed by the Sinn Féin youth movement. So I will say that their version, they're speaking for the community louder in these murals because they are just painting more of them than necessarily other, or at least they're putting their signature on more. Again, a lot of these aren't claims, a lot of them are anonymous, or they have mural artists with kind of a moniker. So I can't tell, I can't tell who they are, maybe other people can. But so I can't identify for you an actual split, especially in the late 80s. I will say that mural painting in the late 80s kind of dips based on how many are being painted. And then it goes back up again at different times. But yeah, there are the majority that are signed, if they are signed by either kind of who at the time would have been a Sinn Féin supporter, some of them now no longer do, or kind of the Sinn Féin youth movement. So those murals are speaking more for the community than I guess than other groups that did not spend the same amount of time making murals, if that makes sense.
Hi, Rachel. So a question, do you have any views on where we're at now, to bring it back to the idea of contemporary, of like what should be going on? There's one just gone up on the Ulmer Road just as I walk into work, of just the Ulmer Bridge. And so I'm presuming that's Belfast City Council. And I agree with your point earlier, mate, that they're all political in some sense. You'd say a bridge is very symbolic in Northern Ireland, and that particular bridge and the fact that it's historically at least two different communities either side. But I'm guessing, so the question would then relate to like how important this is for tourism here, and kind of dark tourism and taxi tours and all that kind of stuff, because I guess that you've still got that tension of tourists coming here. They can have the symbolism of the Ulmer Bridge explained to them or whatever, but far more unique is the mural of 1916 or a mural that's protesting about the Orange Order parades back in the 90s that went across the Ulmer Bridge or whatever. So something that's, just any views on this idea of what you've got now, that kind of much more, it's still about more violence, but it's much more progressive and forward-looking, progressive, but Thomas Bill have different views about that should be the way forward versus those who want to still have the, what can be seen as much more negative imagery and what that means to kids and so on versus what tourists want to see. So I know that's a bit meandering, but hopefully that's
I think no, it's a great point. I will say everyone who I know that's an American that wants to come to Belfast is like, okay, so draw me a map of where I go to see murals. And I was like, it's just because I spend all my time talking about murals and you're like in my vague vicinity that you know about, right? Kind of taking a mural tour. So yeah, I do point everyone in that direction, but that's for my own selfish reasons. But yeah, I mean, there are plenty of issues of dark tourism, but I think that as of today, I can't answer, right? I don't live here. I'm not a resident of Belfast. I'm not a community member. I don't belong. I will also phrase that I don't belong to any of these communities, if that was not clear, that I'm researching. So it's not per se my opinion can be my opinion on that, but it shouldn't matter. But my opinion is I think that there's obviously room and a world for both, right? I think that Belfast, as of right now, does a great job making room for both, right? So as Susie said, so this past weekend, there's a huge kind of group, I don't even know the number of muralists that were in Belfast this past weekend for kind of this painting the north, kind of they took over that whole block party, they took over a whole street, they painted a bunch of work, there was a bunch of different works around the city. And I think that something like that can live in the same space as, you know, having a group of tourists walk to the International Wall, right, and see kind of the murals that are painted there, to see kind of murals that the difference between kind of the, you know, maybe the 1916 memorial or the Bobby Sands mural that's there for a specific reason that memorializes something versus something like the International Wall, which changes quite frequently based on present kind of contemporary issues. So I do think that I don't think there has to be one or the other. I think that there's room for both. I think that there's room for people in a city to express and enjoy both. And also for, if it's a thing for tourists to also have both. You can have non-political, political murals in the city center, and also allow a community to put up a mural that's important to them, right? Because in my opinion, it's not, if you say no, one, it's just going to happen anyway, right? And two, I think that a community mural is, for me, again, I'm a huge nerd on this, obviously, but it's a great kind of barometer to check in. Like if I were running a city, I would never say no to what a community mural would go up, right? Unless it was something like really, like we're talking like, you know, really crossing the line, but that's a barometer, right? To check in on how that community feels. And I am a firm belief that if a community doesn't like a mural, they will let that mural and that whoever put that up will know, right? A paint bomb is a thing. A complaint to the city council is a thing. And people did it in the 70s, they did it in the 80s, they did it in the 90s, they still do it now, right? A full page write-up of why the mural on the end of the gable end is crap and doesn't belong there will come out. So I think that there's space for both. I think a city like Belfast, and really all cities, should and can have both. And I think it allows, it allows for both tourists to come and look at beautiful artwork and take pretty pictures on an Instagram post, and also learn a little history or learn about the community which you've kind of come to see. So I think that there's both, and I enjoy both. Hope that made sense.
Any other questions online? No? Yeah. Any last ones from the room?
Can I just come back on? I mean, I like the idea of murals as sort of innocent and kind of nice, and it's all tolerate whatever. Everyone can have their own pictures and so on. But I mean, there is the marking of territory point that's been made, which I think is problem. I mean, there's a chill factor of people not being willing to cross into territory where kind of paving stones are painted in a particular kind of way. So there is a sort of keep art aspect to these sort of painting as well, which is more, I think that's a problematic aspect of artwork, which has a keep art kind of quality to it.
No, I mean 100%. So a mural is an artifact, right? If you really want to quote Neil Drummond, right? A mural is an artifact, and it should be studied as a thing. It can't be removed from the place that it's in, right? It cannot be removed from the space it's in. Part of understanding the importance and the work of a mural is the space that it occupies. A mural marks territory 100%, but I'm going to be honest with you, that territory was marked before the mural came. If the mural came down, the territory would still be marked, right? People are not afraid to step onto that corner because the paving stones are painted that way. There's a reason why they don't want to step into that neighborhood. It's just that a mural or these kind of things allow people to explore or to display that marking of a territory, which in some instances is something that I think is needed. Now, you're correct, it is the marking of a territory, but the territory is marked with or without the mural, right? It's not for, a mural is not really for the outside, it's for the inside, it's for the community, right? The people who live there know that it's their community, it's for them. And as an outsider, you may go in or kind of round a corner and have a negative or a reaction to a mural, but that mural wasn't painted realistically for you as an outsider, it's painted for the community, and they would have marked that territory with or without the mural. Does it help? Yes. Does it mark the territory? 100%. But so I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think that a mural is, the root of my work is basically arguing that a mural isn't just this thing on the wall. It does have agency. So that agency, as you said, can be, you know, if some people don't like it, then that's understandable, but it's not, in my opinion, for an outsider, it's for the inside community.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Can we thank Rachael for it's great stuff. We look forward to the monograph coming.
Thank you.
In good time. So we have one more seminar in our weekly series, which is next Monday. As Rachel mentioned, we've got Hugh Bennett from Cardiff University coming to talk about his new book, Uncivil Wars, the British Army and the Troubles from 1966 to 74. So that's a joint event with the Mitchell Institute, but it will be in here in this room at 4:30 next Monday, the 3rd of May. Available online as well for people who are joining us that way. So hopefully we'll see quite a few of you back next Monday. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just one other thing, just due to a late cancellation, we have one dinner place. So if anyone wants to come and talk to me afterwards, you get a freebie.
Thank you so much.
More of your wonderful conversation.